what you're doing now the light's on, brighter.
I'm recording. Okay.
Okay, everything's working good?
Yeah, I didn't know what I was doing. I think everything is going well now, and I'm so sorry.
That's all right. That's all right.
I don't use this camera very much, but
It's a work in progress.
All right.
Okay, I don't know if we got the beginning of
You're
it.
gonna have to start over again, and I'm just gonna sit here for a few minutes.
All right.
Go ahead.
Okay, we're covering this week the nervous system and the special senses. Yeah. All right, so when we look at the nervous system, we break it down into two primary components: the CNS, or the central nervous system, which includes exclusively the brain and the spinal cord. So if anybody ever asks you what constitutes the central nervous system, it's the brain and the spinal cord. The other division is the so-called peripheral nervous system, which basically is everything else, nervous-wise. And the peripheral nervous system is further subdivided into what they call the somatic nervous system, which by and large is that part of the peripheral nervous system that is under voluntary control. And for the most part, we're talking about control of skeletal muscle. Okay? The second division of the peripheral nervous system is the autonomic nervous system. And you can think of that term autonomic like automatic. It operates under involuntary control without our awareness. The autonomic nervous system is further subdivided into two divisions: the sympathetic nervous system, which is that division of the autonomic nervous system that prepares the body for stress, the so-called fight or flight response. We're either going to stand and fight or we're going to run. We're going to do something to deal with the stress. And then the parasympathetic nervous system, which we'll sort of designate as the maintenance division, and it's involved in returning the body to a more normal homeostatic condition following some sort of sympathetic stimulation. Okay? We run into stressful situations throughout the course of our day, and things happen, and our body prepares for it. And it's a protective mechanism. Okay? For instance, I used the Henrico County thing, but let's just say in where I work in a juvenile prison, and let's just say I have one of my residents that decides he's having a bad day and he wants to fight, and he wants to fight me, and I pick up on that, and my brain picks up on that, and so my body starts to go into action. Okay? Some of the typical sympathetic type responses are: my heart rate will go up, pump more blood. My rate and depth of respiration will increase, bring in more oxygen, blow off more CO2. My blood pressure will go up. The blood vessels that go to my skeletal muscle will dilate, okay, to bring more blood to my skeletal muscles in case I have to stand and fight. The blood, in contrast, the blood vessels to my kidneys and to my intestines will constrict, because if I'm fighting, I don't want to be having to stop and go to the bathroom. I don't want to be involved in digesting a meal because I want more of the blood to go to my skeletal muscles so I can protect myself. Okay? And so this goes on until the stress is ended. And once the stress is ended, the parasympathetic division will kick in and return all of those conditions back to their normal homeostatic status. In other words, my heart rate will go down, my blood pressure will go down, the blood vessels to my skeletal muscles will constrict a bit, the blood vessels to my kidneys and to my intestines will enlarge so that I can start to produce urine to get rid of waste. I can start to digest food if there's any in there, or get rid of any waste that's in my intestines, and just bring me down to a normal homeostatic state. Okay? And under normal conditions, these two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, they work in concert with one another, depending upon what's going on at the time. For the most part, and we hope, unless you're an extreme type A personality, your parasympathetic tone, which is the term that's used to describe it, will dominate, because we're all out here to survive, right? So we want to protect our internal environment and keep it as calm and cool and collected as we can so that we can enjoy a long, healthy life. Okay. There is a third division, I don't believe it's mentioned in your text, of the autonomic nervous system called the enteric. But we won't address that because when I was going through this textbook, I didn't see reference to it, but the enteric division primarily deals with reflexive actions that occur in our digestive tract. Okay, there is a reflex out there that's called the gastrocolic reflex. I don't know if it happens to you, but it does happen to me, and fortunately for me that it does. I get up in the morning, make the coffee, sort of get myself together, have a cup of coffee, and then almost immediately I have to use the restroom. Okay? Gastro meaning stomach, colic referring to the colon where we expel waste. So stimulation in the gastric part results in a stimulation of the colon, and I feel the need to go to the restroom. Okay, so it's important to make these distinctions: central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, and then that the peripheral nervous system is further subdivided into the somatic, that which we voluntarily control, and the autonomic, which we do not voluntarily control. Now we will, and when you go through it and you look in your text, and I want you to think about it like this too, because you will be asked to differentiate between what may be a sympathetic response and a parasympathetic response. And when you're thinking about that, or think about what would you want your body to be doing under a particular circumstance. For instance, you're going to step in the ring with Mike Tyson, okay? So what do you want your body to do? Well, you want your heart rate to go up because you want to pump more blood, bring more oxygen and nutrient to your muscle. You want your breathing rate to increase, to bring in more oxygen, get rid of more CO2. You want your blood pressure to go up so that all of those muscles get perfused so that they receive their blood supply. You want your pupils to dilate, to get bigger, to bring in as much light as they can. You know, in case Mike throws a right hook, you want to see it coming. Okay? You don't want to be digesting food, so the blood vessels that go to your intestines will constrict, reduce the blood flow to those areas. You don't want the blood flow to your kidneys to be great, because you don't want to have to, stop and say, hey Mike, hold on, I got to go, take a leak. So when you think about the difference between these two responses, think about what you want your body to be doing in a stressful situation and what you don't want it to be doing. And that'll help in differentiating between what is a sympathetic and a parasympathetic response. And again, we won't focus on the enteric nervous system at this point because it's not addressed in the text, and in the interest of time, we're just not going to do that. Okay. So when I'm going through this and we're looking at...
I think we're good to go. I just didn't hit the right button.
That's all right, we're good.
Yeah.
All right, now, we're going to start off in the... with nerves, to look at, like we did with bones and muscles, well not so much with muscles, but we did with bones. We'll look at a composite, if you will, of a typical neuron, a nerve cell. And we have many different types of nerve cells, okay? But a neuron, nerve cell, we have many different types and many different shapes, but all of them have similar characteristic and structure. Okay? We'll start off with the central area of a neuron called the cell body. Then we have an area, well, it's called the axon hillock, but basically we'll deal with we have an axon, which conducts electrical impulses away from the cell body. And a good way to remember that is the axon starts with A and away starts with A. All right? Of course, the cell body has a nucleus, and there are other inclusions or other materials that are inside the cell body, but we're going to just deal with the basic parts. And then extending from the cell body, we have these other structures that are called dendrites. All right. Now, what's important to remember about dendrites, cell body, and axons is that dendrites conduct impulses toward the cell body. Okay, so in other words, the impulse, the electricity is coming down this way, passes across the cell membrane of the cell body, down an axon to the end of an axon terminal. Okay, and like muscle tissue, nervous tissue conducts electricity, albeit very low voltage electricity, but electricity nonetheless. Okay, so basically we have dendrites, cell body, axon terminal. And you can see, if you can use your mind's eye and sort of imagine, that these dendrites do have several functions, and one of them is that they form connections with other nerves, other neurons, okay? And much like the connection between a motor nerve and a skeletal muscle fiber, the connection between these are called synapses. You know, you talk to folks of our generation and say, yeah, well, you know, I grew up in the 60s and I burned out a whole bunch of my synapses in my brain. Well, the truth of it is that throughout the course of our lives, inside of our brain, we make or establish synapses, and synapses are lost and throughout the course of our lives. And this particular situation is referred to as neuroplasticity. Which again refers to making and breaking connections between neurons. As an example, there have been studies done looking at the brains of infants and young children, very young children, and measuring the so-called dendritic densities in an infant brain and an adult brain. Okay, the dendritic density meaning the number and of these dendrites and connections between neurons. And obviously, as young infants, haven't been exposed to a lot of stimulus, and so the densities are much less in children than they are in adults. And as we grow and as we learn and as we remember and as we forget, we make new connections and break old connections. Okay, and you know they're finding in a lot of the brain research that you know we make and maintain connections. So you know things so-called like long-term memory, and emotion is associated with that. I went to Catholic school for 8 years of my life as in grade school. Okay, can't tell you a thing about my second grade school teacher, what I learned in second grade, or even where I went to school. But what I can tell you about second grade is that I do remember is that I got paddled for chewing gum, taking gum out of my mouth and sticking it under the table, under my chair. And I had to go down and see, you know, the father, the priest, and bend over, grab your ankles, and you got a whooping. Now, there's a certain emotion associated with that, and so that particular synapse, or synapses more likely, is maintained. Other sort of non-emotional types of memories, we break those and they don't come back. Anyway, dendrites conduct impulses toward the cell body. Travels across membrane, and then the axon conducts impulses away from the cell body. Now this electrical conduction in our brain, like our muscles, these are electrochemical events. All right? Electro in that there is some stimulus that occurs. Be it I stick myself with a pin and it stimulates a pain receptor, most likely a dendrite from a sensory neuron in my skin, and then that stimulation causes a depolarization, which we'll go over in a minute, and an electrical impulse is carried down that dendrite to the cell body, to the axon, and there are probably, well, in the case of pain, maybe not so many, but at the end of these axon terminals are like the skeletal muscles. We have these vesicles that contain neurotransmitters. And there are hundreds. Okay? And so when the electrical impulse reaches the axon terminal, or the end bulb, I guess is the term they use in the book, it causes a change in permeability to calcium, and calcium ions infuse into the end bulb, and what ends up happening is these vesicles will fuse with the membrane of the end bulb and release their contents into the synapse. That neurotransmitter will diffuse across the synapse, contact receptors on, in this case, we'll say the cell membrane of the axon, the cell body, the cell body. That cell body will depolarize and that electrical impulse will be conducted. Now you can have several different types of connections. You can have an axon to a cell body, a dendrite to a cell body, a dendrite to an axon, a dendrite to another dendrite, because there's like millions of these neurons in our brain and in our spinal cord with just countless numbers of connections, synapses. Okay, but what's important? Electrochemical, conducted by means of electricity and by means of neurotransmitters. Okay? And if you can block that anywhere along the way, then you block the nerve impulse. For example, well, first, before I do that example, let's identify, which I think they do here, the different types of nerve cells that we have in our central nervous system. Now we're on page 266, all right, and the primary types of nerve cells are microglial cells. Okay, and collectively these types that we're going to mention are called neuroglia. Okay, and if you look, and all I want you to be familiar with is just the base function of these particular types of cells, like the microglia cells. They are supportive cells, and then they carry out a process called phagocytosis. Phago, meaning to eat, and cyto, meaning cell, and SIS, condition of. All right, so these types of cells carry out a function called phagocytosis, which means that they eat things. Cellular debris is that support neuron, phagocytized bacterial cells. You know, when we get an infection in our central nervous system, they break down and get rid of cellular debris. And then should we, God forbid, suffer some sort of injury to our brain, the brain heals, like the muscles heal, primarily by scar formation. By and large, now there are some exceptions, but by and large, neurons that are in the central nervous system do not regenerate. Okay, so if you suffer some sort of stroke, if you will, a CVA, cerebrovascular accident, and neurons in the brain are destroyed, and they don't like a lot of potassium, so that's what happens when you blow a blood vessel or something, but they will not regenerate. They're gone. Okay, so for the most part,
spinal cord injuries.
And spinal cord injuries. That's why, the kids ask me, about, well, why can't, if somebody has a brain injury, they get shot in the head, because that's what they can relate to, why can't we just take somebody else's brain and put it in there that isn't injured? And I said, well, you've got to think about that now. We have billions of these nerve cells, and each individual one has to be connected to its proper counterpart. And if you don't do that, you may go to, and I kind of jokingly say, you may go to open the door and your leg starts to shake because they weren't connected properly. So only on Star Trek can you replace a brain, okay? Because again, they don't regenerate. So these microglial supportive cells, and I mean structural support, and then this is an important function, phagocytosis, like when you get encephalitis or some sort of infection in the brain, okay? The second type is called oligodendrocytes, all right? Now, the important function and what the take-home message on these oligodendrocytes is that in the CNS, and that's where they're found, they produce what's known as myelin. And we'll kind of differentiate that or explain that a little bit further, a little bit down the road. But what this myelin does, this is a fatty coating of neurons in the brain and in the spinal cord. And you can think of this myelin as sort of an insulating sheath. Okay, you've heard of perhaps you've heard of a disease known as multiple sclerosis. Near and dear to my heart because my mother had it. And what happens is, the sclerosis part that they're talking about is that the neurons in the brain and a lot in the spinal cord, something has happened, and it could be some sort of viral infection. There could be, and there has been noted, a genetic component to it, but the upshot of it is that this myelin sheath develops these plaques along this insulating sheath. And what that does is that it interferes with the normal conduction of electrical impulses in the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, and you'll see in 1 second why myelin is important in the conduction of electricity. Myelinated axons conduct electricity much faster than axons that are not myelinated. And we have both. Okay, the myelinated axons, because of its appearance, its whitish type appearance, makes up the white matter in the brain and the spinal cord. The unmyelinated axons and the cell bodies of neurons make up what is known as the gray matter in the brain and spinal cord. Okay? All right. Just to recap, the microglial cells, supportive cells, very important in phagocytosis, help cleaning up. They're, sort of scavengers that go out and just clean up garbage in the brain. Oligodendrocytes, they produce the myelin sheath in the central nervous system. And I bring that up because in the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, a different cell type carries that out. All right, third type is an astrocyte. Okay, astro because they say that it looks like a star up in the sky. Okay, these are found between neurons and blood vessels. If you look between neurons and blood, they provide structural support. Just like the microglial cells, and they also provide for something that's known as the blood-brain barrier.
Hey, they moved the place on me.
Well, they moved me because apparently it's pretty busy down there.
Okay, I don't want to be on camera. I'm unprepared because
That's all right.
I'm off at 3 today, but I was at 7.
We're taping it, so don't worry. Be up tomorrow, I'll send you a link.
Now this blood-brain barrier, this helps to control.
What you need, paper? Sure.
Yeah. Okay, it says, that helps regulate the concentration of nutrients and ions within brain tissue, and they form scar tissue when there is an injury, okay? What we're talking about, Cassandra, is the different types of nerve cells that are within the brain,
Okay.
collectively known as glial cells, neuroglia. There was a movie out, actually it was a pretty good movie, with John Travolta. You remember that movie called Phenomenon? And you remember what his problem was? He had a tentacled astrocytoma. Okay, in other words, it was a sort of a, I guess you can refer to it as a cancerous type of growth of these astrocytes. They just start to divide and divide and divide, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger. And initially, if you remember the movie, well, it woke up parts of the brain, so he was able to do amazing things, but eventually it got too big that it started to impede blood flow and it killed him. Okay? Anyway, that's what that was. And then the fourth type of cell are called ependymal cells. Okay? And these are the ones that line these specialized structures in the brain, like one that I'll just put out there and then we'll refer to it later, called the choroid plexus. Now this is tissue in the brain that forms cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. Okay. Okay. And again, you're going to need to peruse through the text. I'm just going to hit on the high points because we ran out of time last time when we were going through that. Okay. Now, I bring up this oligodendrocyte and stress its importance, and a take-home message for this is that it produces the myelin sheath in the CNS, and then there is a cell in the peripheral nervous system that produces myelin sheaths and it's called a Schwann cell, named after the fellow that characterized it. Okay? And there's a big difference because this Schwann cell in the peripheral nervous system has a structure that is known as the neurolemma.
So the
And why is that important? Huh, I'm sorry?
The PNS is also in the.
Well, no, this is the peripheral nervous system. You kind of, we had started and we said that the nervous system in general is divided into two major divisions. The central,
Okay.
which is the brain and spinal cord, and then the peripheral, which is basically everything else.
Okay.
Okay? Now, this neurolemma is important because it allows for regeneration of nervous tissue in the peripheral nervous system, okay? And we need to make sure we understand that. Regeneration of neurons in the PNS, of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so, just to sort of recap, in the central nervous system, by and large, neurons do not regenerate. If we suffer an injury in the central nervous system, that's it. It's done. It'll heal by fibrosis, scar formation. However, in the peripheral nervous system, if we suffer nerve damage, because of this Schwann cell and this structure known as the neurolemma, this will allow nerves to regenerate in the peripheral nervous system. And you may have, I'm sure you have, heard of this. Somebody is, out there cutting wood and they inadvertently chop off their hand. They pick it up, take it to the hospital, undergo surgery, they reattach the hand, the bones, and reattach nerves, and then all of a sudden the hand will work somewhat again. Some of the nerves will reestablish connections and will regenerate. Now, obviously, it's not going to be 100% like it was because just of the number of neurons that have to be reconnected, but there is regeneration of nerve tissue in the periphery, in the PNS, peripheral nervous system. But again, by and large, and there are some exceptions like satellite cells, but we're not going to get into that. So when we talk about central nervous system, we'll say, by and large, no regeneration. Okay? All right. We covered the composite. And if you look, there's a diagram on page 267, figure 9.3, and you can see sort of these different types of neurons. You can see an astrocyte and what it does. And this right here, these connections here, this is what I refer to as the blood-brain barrier. Now when pharmacists or pharmaceutical chemists, when they're designing drugs and when they're synthesizing drugs, they have to take this into account. Do we want this drug to be able to pass through the blood-brain barrier and get into the nervous tissue in the brain or not? Okay, and you'll see that if you have when you get an insert in your whatever medication that you happen to pick up at the pharmacy, you'll read through, that whole, the pages of it, and you'll see probably, and most likely you will see there'll be some notation as to does not cross the blood-brain barrier. Okay? Okay. Remember, oligodendrocytes produce the myelin in the central nervous system. The Schwann cells produce the myelin in the peripheral nervous system. Now, why do we care about this myelin?